We are all used to hearing that after the end of our earthly existence, a wondrous world of afterlife opens up before a person. But in reality, things are not as bright as we would like them to be. There are matters that many prefer not to speak about, deliberately keeping silent about certain shocking facts that may await us on the other side of biological existence. Many doctors who constantly face the death of patients inevitably become cynical, not prone to sentimentality. Seeing people die every day, they get used to believing that on the other side of death there is only emptiness. And so, when asked what they think happens to those who leave this world, they often reply, absolutely nothing. Once, the resuscitation doctor and medical scientist Rollings Moritz held exactly the same opinion. For nearly 20 years, he devoted himself to the noble task of bringing people back from the brink of death. For a long time, he was completely uninterested in what happened to them on the other side of life. In principle, he did not believe in any otherworldly realm at all. But everything changed after one incident, which radically overturned not only his worldview but also completely altered the direction of his chosen career. It compelled him to study closely what is called the near-death experience. And here is how it happened. A middle-aged patient was admitted to the intensive care unit after his heart had stopped. At first, everything proceeded according to the doctor's already familiar routine. He began performing the necessary procedures to save the man. At that moment, for him it was just routine work. But about what happened afterward, Rollings Moritz later said the following: after carrying out all the standard measures for such a case, the patient finally regained consciousness but looked extremely terrified. He trembled with fear and kept repeating over and over, "Doctor, don't let me go back there again." Had he not been so weakened, he probably would have screamed in terror. For the first time, I saw a person so frightened after returning from the other side of life. Usually, after resuscitation, people are either confused, exhausted, or grateful for being saved. But such panic in a patient I had never seen before. Such a reaction to being brought back from the dead greatly puzzled the cardiologist. Consumed by curiosity, he could not resist asking what had caused such an intense response. The patient explained that after death, he had fallen into some kind of pit where it was dark and unbearably lonely. The man could not finish his story because he began trembling from fear again. He once more begged the doctor not to let him return to that dreadful place. And yet, despite such an emotional reaction, the cardiologist, who had seen many things, paid little attention to it. He considered it merely an unusual response to stress. After all, the man had gone through clinical death, and probably everything would have ended there. But a few days later, Rollings Moritz once again visited the patient he had recently saved. This was necessary to check his health condition. At that time, he tried once more to ask about the terrifying visions the patient had seen beyond our earthly existence. But to the doctor's great surprise, the man replied quite sincerely that he remembered nothing of the sort. "Excuse me, doctor, but what are you talking about? I don't remember anything that could have frightened me. On the contrary, I met there an amazing and kind woman about 20 years old. Very beautiful and sweet. She introduced herself as my mother. But that is not true. My real mother looks completely different." After such a response, Rollings Moritz was even more puzzled. Not only had his patient now denied his previous terrible stories, but he also revealed new ones. The resuscitation doctor realized he would not rest until he figured out what was going on. Without informing the patient, he contacted his father and relayed his son's description of the woman he had encountered in the other world. The father's comments literally stunned the cardiologist, making him marvel at the situation for the third time. It turned out that the father of the rescued man had been married twice. Unfortunately, his first wife had died. Not wanting to traumatize his son's psyche, he never dared to tell him about her. Moreover, he soon remarried. But the fact was that the first wife had been his son's biological mother, someone the young man had not only never heard of but also never seen a single photograph of. So the cardiologist's patient had doubted in vain the truth of the woman's words, the one who had greeted him beyond the threshold separating life from death. This case left an indelible impression on Rollings Moritz, forcing him to seriously reflect on what really happens after a person dies. From then on, he began to question patients in detail about what they had experienced at the moment when doctors were fighting for their lives. Thanks to these studies, the doctor came to the conclusion that beyond death there exists another life. But unlike similar research, which contained exclusively positive recollections of the afterlife, Rollings Moritz also collected testimonies from patients that could in no way be considered pleasant. On the contrary, they were frightening and compelled a more critical attitude toward near-death experiences, even making one recall the notion of hell. He concluded that after the end of earthly existence, not everyone will encounter something pleasant. Punishment for sinners will indeed come, of that there can be no doubt. Rollings Moritz conducted countless interviews and experiments, about which he said the following: "I interviewed all resuscitated patients. But only about 20% of them agreed to share their impressions from the otherworldly realm. These accounts freed me from the darkness of ignorance and skepticism. They convinced me that beyond death there is another life. I have repeatedly witnessed that the deceased can see and hear the doctors in the room. And this is easy to verify. There is no doubt they really do perceive everything around them when the beating of life has stopped in their bodies. So it is the living who suffer from a certain spiritual blindness toward the invisible world, while the perception of the so-called dead, on the contrary, expands. The doctor also made an interesting observation. It turns out that if a patient is questioned immediately after resuscitation, they are more likely to speak about frightening experiences of death rather than a pleasant transition to the other world. According to the cardiologist, over time, such distressing and troubling experiences are pushed into the subconscious. In conscious memory, only pleasant recollections remain, or sometimes nothing at all. That is why, at first glance, life after death may seem somewhat like heaven. But in reality, this is not always the case. According to those who survived clinical death and were saved, the journey into the spiritual realms usually begins with the deceased seeing their own body, from which life has departed. At the same time, they are able to hear and see everything happening around them. Then the soul leaves the place of death, entering a dark corridor. However, for not everyone does the journey through this tunnel end in light. A significant number reported falling into a dark cave or to the bottom of a deep pit, where it was cold and gloomy. Everything there is shrouded in mist. The beings inhabiting those regions resemble shadows exuding the horror of doom. In that place, emptiness, apathy, and hopelessness prevail. Some even admitted attempting to escape from those places, but felt an insurmountable burden, like a huge stone, preventing them from leaving this abode of darkness. They quickly came to understand that the burden keeping them in the dark realm was their own sins. These sins prevent the soul from rising into the brighter regions of the afterworld. Naturally, few who have gone through such a terrifying experience would share it with others, as it reveals very unpleasant truths about themselves. Therefore, they not only hide it from other people but often from themselves, repressing the horrifying memories from consciousness. This is why the testimonies shared by patients immediately after being brought back from the dead are so important. At that point, they have not yet fully processed what happened and have not erected psychological defenses against it. At the end of his life, Rawlings Moritz said, "Throughout human history, mystics have spoken of the existence of life after death. But only now, thanks to modern resuscitation techniques, are we truly beginning to penetrate this great mystery. Perhaps existence after death is not only an enigma but also a hope for humanity." The extraordinary encounters my patients experienced had the deepest impact on them, changing their attitude toward life and what comes after it. I have never met a patient who, after experiencing this, remained an atheist. As with any similar example, everyone is free to choose what to believe and what not to believe. But if this is true, some of us would do well to carefully reflect on our actions and, while it is not too late, correct those deeds that could lead the soul into the terrifying realms of the afterworld. Write in the comments what you think about this. Also, like the video and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss new interesting videos on various mystical topics. Thank you very much for watching. Wishing you all long life and goodness.